The following movies were shot by my grandparents in the early 30s, mostly 1933, around the area of Doheny, Dana Point, Princess Point local area. This is part of about 4 hours of 16 millimeter movies that he shot going from the 30s through the 40s. I'm going to try and narrate through this and give you a little idea of what it is you're looking at in particular. These first clips here were on the headlands of Dana Point, looking north towards what is now, or was then, Salt Creek and Monarch Beach. There is the Dana Point looking at what is Salt Creek, and in the very distant there you can barely see Monarch Beach. There's a little controversy going on now because they're talking about building on these headlands, and there's a lot of people a little upset with that. What the heck, they ran across a rattlesnake, I guess, and that was the general way they dealt with rattlesnakes in 1933. There's my grandmother, my mom, and my uncle. You're looking south, and you see Princess Point, which is no longer there in the background. That old dirt road is actually still there. Now, you'll see they mention my grandfather was big on putting captions in his movies, but the Richard Henry Dana book, 2 years before The Mast, was a big draw, actually, to people coming to Doheny. Now, this is part of what they call Dana Strands. It's on around the northern tip of Dana Point. You're looking at Dana Point. This is looking south here. The waves, boy, I tell you, that could be today in color if you were looking at that right now. The only difference being, of course, behind you there, they're covered with homes. This is probably the most classic shot. This is sitting at Doheny in a place they call Boneyards, one of the favorite surf spots. Looking north, that is Princess Point, and in the distance you see Dana Point. Princess Point is no longer there. It was carved away when the harbor was built in the late 60s. The profile of Dana Point, of course, still looks the same today. Here is my mom and my uncle again, and they are in Dana Strands area. That was Salt Creek in the background. Yeah, I can see where my kids got their energy looking at my mom jump up and down like that right now. This actually is at Doheny also, looking south towards San Clemente. San Clemente was incorporated, I believe, in 1928. The first roads and homes and things were carved out in 25 and 26. This is down towards the northern part of Doheny State Park, looking at Princess Point as well. Those rocks were carved away. That's probably just about where the jetty is now. This again is a classic shot from Princess Point looking at Dana Point. Dana Point was known as Killer Dana in the surfing era during the late 50s and 60s. Now this is an interesting shot here looking at Princess Point, and no one I talked to the whole day has ever realized why it was called Princess Point. But if you look at that small figure there, you can kind of see the figurehead of a princess. Sandstone erodes rather quickly, so when I started coming down in the early 60s, that was no longer there. This excuse me, is a shot looking up towards San Juan Capistrano. That is the Villa restaurant, which was actually demolished just within the last couple years. Real pity. But a lot of visitors who came and didn't want to camp and visit the local area stayed at the villa instead of staying in tents. Another reference, of course, to Richard Henry Dana. In its early years, the allure, I think, to visit this area was to visit the nearby pristine waters of Princess Point and Dana Point. The fishing, the abalone was incredible even when I was a child. This again is around the northern tip of Dana Point, and you could look at that scene today and it's pretty much the same. The waves break pretty much the same way as well. In the early days, I think before surfing, at least before the 50s, like I say, the Dana Point, Princess Point were one of the main draws to Doheny. Here's some campers down at Dana Strands. The tents look familiar to me. I grew up camping in one of these old World War I surplus tents of my grandfather's. Even camped in one in Doheny, I remember when I was a young child. During the 50s, when surfing kind of took root, one of the other draws, of course, to this area was the surfing at Doheny, which have made famous, I think, by the Beach Boys. It had a nice kind of gentle wave. It was very consistent. And, of course, one of the favorite breaks of some of the well-known surfers was a little spot called Knee Peas at Princess Point. Now, this footage, it's in color, but looking at the age of my mom and my uncle, I figured it had to be pre-war. Having homemade color films was probably not a common thing at the time, but the skimboarding, most of the surfers and people who are familiar with surfing saw this and had never seen a picture of a guy skimboarding or movies of a guy skimboarding during this time. Now, I threw in some of the other footage here, just thought you might get a kick out of it, of the local area. This is South Laguna, very recognizable to anyone who's been down in that area. And you will see in a moment that little kind of turret there on the point. That is still down there, and some of the homes, of course, in Laguna were built prior to the homes in Dana Point and down in San Clemente area. I started to mention about the surfing down in Dana Point. During the 50s and 60s, I think the draw to people coming down to Doheny changed a little bit from the focus of fishing and hiking down to the points, and you saw kind of a different crowd start to arrive at Doheny. A lot of them, of course, just going down for the day and surfing the waves down there. This still is South Laguna. Now here, I believe, is the Newport Pier. I might be wrong, but I'm pretty sure it's the Newport Pier. My mom in the kind of the foreground there fishing. There she is and my uncle fishing off the pier. Love those poles. There is, in this footage that I have, just a large variety of places and scenes, and I thought I'd throw a few of them in there, and I knew you'd get a kick out of them. I think this is probably one of the locals' fishing boats here, going out through the surf, which they used to do in years past. I think you did a show on it, matter of fact, at one point in time. Now here's the local mission. He's got a couple different missions I think he's filmed. This one in September 33. Now I know there was a large earthquake, I think in Long Beach in 33. I don't remember if it was before or after. The mission in these scenes, it looks like they hadn't done any restoration at all up until this point. I traveled down to the mission, I think, my first time in the late 50s, and I seem to remember it looking pretty much just like this. My mom, my uncle, and my grandmother here. I know you've done a number of shows on the mission, or a number of the missions up and down the coast here. I think this was also one of the draws to people visiting Doheny, especially in its early days. The link between Dana Point and Richard Henry Dana and the mission and the throwing down of the hides over the cliff and whatnot. It was a short car trip from Doheny up to the mission to do a little sightseeing. Now, I don't know how safe that was, sitting by the bells knowing how crumbling they are today. One thing I found interesting about this shot was the color of the pigeons. They're all white, pure white. Being a biology and physics teacher at San Clemente High School, I couldn't help notice that today you don't see that pure white pigeon, and the size of the pigeons are kind of amazing as well. Some things have changed. I'm not quite sure why, but they have. Now, I showed this footage to a number of local guys in well-known surfing industry, as well as some of the guys in charge of the state parks, and they were just pretty much enthralled by what they saw in the footage here. There's not a lot of home movies probably shot in the 30s, and I feel really fortunate to have this. My brother and myself, my dad, my mom passed away last year, and that's kind of when I pulled this out and found it, and realized actually what we had. My mom had taken the 16 millimeter film, and she had it transferred to a VHS tape. I've started taking that video on tape and transferring it digitally to get it onto my Mac computer, and that's what you're looking at right here. It would be a shame to lose some of this stuff. There's a lot of history here.